Well, thank you all for having me today. I am Sarah Stark. I'm a human skeletal biologist at Historic England. And today, what I thought I'd talk to you about is a new framework that we're looking to introduce for biomolecular sampling within Historic England funded projects, specifically the Heritage Protection Commissions and Capacity Building HCP projects. Everything apart from radiocarbon dating, which already has a well-established process. So the aim of this is really to kind of take a bit of a step back, actually, and think about biomolecular archaeology in general. So it's quite a rapidly growing discipline that's been picking up speed over some time. And we always want to make sure that we're kind of maximizing that archaeological interpretation while minimizing destructive analysis, especially with human remains, because we have a lot of different ethical sensitivities that we always need to consider. And this work really stems from what we're viewing in the field as we're able to see more refined techniques. They're far more accessible than they used to be. And more excitingly, we're able to ask questions we never really were able to ask previously or to the same level of depth and detail. But kind of with all good things, there's a bit of a flip side to that. So we really want to think about is while we're kind of developing and steamrolling ahead with all of this exciting work, we want to always make sure that we're asking the right questions that it can actually answer and make sure that we have a bit more of a structured support system in terms of how we actually do this kind of work and make sure that we're a bit more standardized with these approaches. Because like any other specialist field like osteoarchaeology, we just want clear pathways within the projects to make sure they're quite transparent and that we're all kind of getting the same level of support. So that's kind of the main background, but we'll sort of see how that actually works in practice or how we're hoping to make that work in practice and some of the difficulties that those of us may be facing today when we're dealing with biomolecular techniques. There's a lot of different current pressures. I know that I deal with these as well within my own projects, and I'm sure you are too. And also how we can maybe sort of adapt already successful models within historic England that deal with such work. So we're not really reinventing the wheel, we're just sort of expanding really. And then more importantly, probably what you may be interested in then is how does this actually work for you? Where does it actually fit within that kind of project life cycle? So as I was sort of saying, within biomolecular archaeology, and I believe you actually already had a talk with kind of on ancient DNA, so it's quite timely in that way. We've got a lot of rapid growth in both terms the scope of projects, so ancient DNA, isotopes, proteomic research, and it's also becoming, again, as I said, a lot more accessible. So we're actually seeing there's a lot more labs popping up. There's a lot more intricacies and nuances that we're able to do with these techniques, and we're actually able to have a greater potential in terms of the types of questions we're able to ask than before. But with these kinds of kind of growth that we're starting to see, there's a lot of different pressures. So sometimes there's a real kind of trade-off with that, and especially kind of the threat-led sector, where we might see that there's sort of this urgency to act now, because within that post-excavation phase, maybe we have the money now. So there's sort of a bit of the sense that we should probably get as much data as we can while we have the material before it goes into archive. Sometimes that's a bit of a pressure. Or maybe there's a lot of external pressures. So things like, there tends to be kind of this bias in a way that may be hard-hitting science. So DNA or destructive work, that's where the science is, and that has higher impact than maybe the traditional methods that we're using, which we know isn't always the case, but sometimes that's a difficult kind of conversation to have to really explain that to different stakeholders. And also we're dealing with short timelines, so maybe we don't have the kind of the ability to really develop big research projects when we're kind of in a bit of a crunch zone as well. But with these pressures that are quite understandable, we kind of are feeling like this is a good time to pause and kind of take a bit of a step back, actually, and think about not what's possible, so not kind of giving a list of sort of different techniques we can do, but really think about, well, what's actually necessary and what's actually going to provide us some more archaeological insight, which is what we're all more or less here to do. And these are things that I tend to remind myself as well when I'm doing my own projects too. And there's quite a lot of interesting debate out there. Again, I'm sure a lot of you have already kind of been kind of keeping up on all of this, but There's a lot of interesting work about specifically DNA, ancient DNA, because again, we're seeing that not just here in the UK, but also kind of around the globe, lots of different projects that are going on. And there's sort of this interesting talk about the Petrus fever. So the idea that kind of getting different insights between museum curators or archaeologists or osteologists or different DNA professionals of kind of what this means to them. And oftentimes, when we have these big kind of laboratory projects, especially in archaeology, they tend to be quite data led because the goal for these laboratories is to create maybe a giant DNA database. And that's kind of what they're after. And they're looking for samples, which is fair enough. But what's quite different and difficult for the archaeology is sometimes when we have that approach of being more kind of that data led, it means that we're kind of stuck trying to find patterns within a massive data set. And it can be quite difficult and rather daunting. So, and we're also kind of then mitigating that kind of common dilemma we have within human remains of always wanting to mitigate the loss of material and the new gain that we'll get from it. So this can be quite difficult with this type of approach. And it also means that we're kind of, rather than having a centered research question where we make the science actually work for us, we're sort of flipping it the other way around and making it slightly harder on ourselves. And sometimes this can lead to quite, maybe technically impressive work, but kind of archaeologically limited work. And we do have some different policies in place. So we do have the Science in the Dead, which does talk about destructive sampling and archaeological remains, and some of the different ethics involved. And again, that kind of mitigation of loss versus generation of new knowledge. But in reality, it can be quite difficult, as I sort of said previously. I know colleagues that I've dealt with and kind of worked with face these quite regularly, where maybe practices vary because, again, there's external pressures. Maybe there's different stakeholders that really want to see certain work done. Maybe there's timing or funding pressures. So it can be quite difficult to kind of keep this consistent standard across the board. So the idea of having a framework is really meant to help kind of add more support within these decisions and making them more transparent. So I kind of put some scenarios as, as kind of this framework was being built, basically, about thinking about what are some of the common issues that some of us are dealing with. Again, I know myself or colleagues have this happen quite a lot, where sometimes if we're working with labs, we find ourselves working towards their timelines rather than our own project timelines. And sometimes that happens if a lab's got a big project, for instance, and they're able to provide free sampling, it means that you're sort of at their timetable whenever they get to your samples. And this can have a really kind of bottlenecking situation when that's not quite ideal, where you're waiting for when they get back to you. Or sometimes this can be quite problematic if that piece of analysis is what's hinging on the rest of the work you're trying to do. So what we want to do with this framework is make sure that we have a dedicated budget, essentially, that will go just to biomolecular work, apart from dating, to try to alleviate some of that pressure. Another kind of scenario that tends to sometimes emerge, not always, but sometimes, is that results can be delivered in highly technical formats. So you may get either a big database, have all sorts of data, whether that's isotopic data or DNA data. And that can be it's fine if I guess that you are the specialist, but that can be quite difficult for teams to kind of decipher what's actually in that data. And it's not always the most useful for project teams. So the idea is making sure that we have very clear, kind of outputs of what we're expecting within this framework and these projects. So that will most likely be in the form of a research report where we have clear questions and clear answers. And there's a lot of projects that are highly successful in doing this already, so that have a lot of early planning in place and laboratory input with different specialists. And these are highly successful. And these are the types of projects that we're trying to build kind of the framework around and try to make sure that everyone's on sort of the same kind of platform, really, and has that same level of support throughout. And really kind of spinning us back a bit more to that research-led approach. So having that more slightly structured decision-making to really integrate into the project execution phase with clear questions and weighing up those ethical sampling strategies is really kind of something that we see successful within other approaches of historic England, such as the scientific dating team. So some of you may already been working with them, but if not, typically the dating team. They work very collaboratively with their post-excavation teams kind of throughout the project usually. They help define the research objectives and develop sampling strategies. They also help oversee budgets and ensure things are delivered more or less timely. And they also really help projects with balancing that ethical oversight with impactful results, which is kind of what we're all kind of geared towards trying to achieve. So what we'll be doing is introducing this biomolecular framework that's following a similar design. So we're not kind of reinventing the wheel necessarily here. And the idea is that the biomolecular sampling will have some oversight within the HCP projects. So this will have a designated biomolecular coordinator at Historic England, which will be myself. And the coordinator will help oversee all biomolecular archaeology, apart from dating from the post-excavation phase onwards. And this will kind of take a slightly more coordinated role. So that way, that will work with relevant specialists, teams, and labs. And this is also to help kind of alleviate some of the times of the specialists so they can focus on what they really need to work on, essentially. And the project management can be kind of more supported within Historic England as well to alleviate some of that time and pressure. Again, as I mentioned, there'll also be a dedicated budget that will be just for biomolecular sampling as well. So we can try to avoid some of that bottlenecking. So what does that look like? Well, so there's a flow chart that we've kind of devised that has a little bit of a little kind of summary that explains this whole process of what I'm talking to you about today, and that will be made available. But what we've decided is we chose human remains to start with primarily because they're the most commonly used when it comes to biomolecular archaeology, and also have the most kind of ethical sensitivities. So eventually we'll kind of look at other biological remains, but at the moment we've sort of just focused on human remains to begin with. And you'll sort of see there's some natural kind of progression points, you can call it, or kind of discussion points that I've kind of broken the flowchart into that we'll talk about in a minute. But really, it's all about kind of evaluating the research potential and seeing if biomolecular archaeology is the most suited to address those questions, develop costed sampling programs, and produce agreeable deliveries. So this isn't really too far off from what projects are already doing. It's just giving it a little bit more of a structure in place. So where this sort of tends to sit is that the coordinator will have lots of discussion with project teams, both kind of early on, but really the actual framework and strategy sort of kicks off a bit more within that project execution assessment phase. So really what would happen in this case is the project osteologist would kind of carry on as they always do. So they would do their project, their osteological assessment. That assessment with the original project design would then be passed to the coordinator to get them up to speed so they can kind of read through what's been going on and kind of get a sense of the project. And then that first round of discussions will happen. So you'll see there's kind of little arrows here, and there'll be quite a lot of back and forth. So the little dashed arrow is kind of a back and forth discussion process. But essentially what we have is the coordinator, the project team, and in this case, the project osteologist will start to evaluate both the project design and any additional questions that came from that assessment to see if biomolecules is most suited to address those questions. That's also an opportunity to start to consult with relevant labs. So whether that's DNA, isotopes, the radiocarbon dating team, it's a chance to start to put some questions into place and to actually talk to these labs to make sure that they can actually answer such questions before we start to really proceed in kind of this little flow chart. It's also not quite so black and white. There is a lot of flexibility. So we may find that, some of the work will carry out. Maybe some things seem quite feasible and maybe some work won't. So it's not kind of an all or nothing approach, but it's just a chance to have that first discussion to kind of see where we're at and if either work will continue or if it'll stop. The next phase is really the nuts and bolts. So that's kind of doing the more discussions with the relevant specialists and starting to think about sampling criteria, sampling strategies. So we've got kind of our clear questions, and it's really just figuring out how many samples do we actually need to be able to answer those questions, thinking about costs, And again, the more complicated the program is, the more that, timings will need to be considered, where things will slot in, and making sure everyone can be, all these pieces can basically be delivered into an agreeable timeline. And this is the next phase, essentially, where again, the coordinator, the project team, and the osteologist will kind of sit down and think about, is the sampling program merited on ethical grounds and value for money? So this is kind of going back to science and the dead. So it's taking those questions and kind of all of the information that's been gathered between discussions with the labs and deciding if work will sort of carry out or part of the work or all of the work. The last part within this sort of phase of that kind of assessment phase is essentially then creating a lab assessment. So this would be the same as, the osteological assessment, but for all of the biomolecular work. So this is taking everything that's been discussed previously and putting it into one kind of clear document. And this is essentially sort of the real kind of touchstone that the team, the labs, everyone will be referring to as we kind of move forward. And this will have the questions, sampling strategy, timelines. It'll all be fit kind of within a Gantt chart. And this is essentially when the contracts for the labs will be awarded. Now, there is a bit of flexibility. So even though we're all about kind of going on about having some structure, there's of course flexibility that can be built in. So there's an option, of course, for things like pilot studies to happen in the analysis phase. So perhaps, maybe you were worried that there wasn't enough collagen, or that it might be quite an issue. So maybe it was decided that actually the dating team would kind of take their dates and assess the collagen preservation before the rest of the work takes place. This would be a point where that would happen, or maybe DNA would happen first, and maybe those results will inform if migration isotopes were to happen, for instance. So there's a bit of flexibility in terms of building out sort of a tiered approach if that's what's decided within that lab assessment phase. And again, another kind of checkpoint of if work will continue or not. But again, we won't always have a pilot study, but it is an option. The last piece is the analysis phase. So again, everything kind of continues as it always does. So the osteologist would then go ahead and finish the recording of all of this material prior to any destructive sampling. Also, that's a chance to do any of the photography, x-rays, any digital work that they may want to do. Again, kind of all leading back to that lab assessment. And also potentially helping out with the biomolecular sampling and returning unused samples. And then from here, the specialists will continue kind of working on their report as they always do. And the coordinator and the project officer will kind of take over a bit of that chasing that may have to happen in terms of checking in with labs and monitoring the progress with the labs and keeping that kind of clear communication open with the project team. Then the labs will deliver their draft research report, which will kind of be a bit of a tick box exercise to ensure that the questions are answered, the data is all present, everything is more or less fitting what we agreed to originally in that lab assessment. And then that research report will be inserted in the site publication text. And that's what can be then used in whatever kind of output was decided within the lab assessment. So the idea is not really to try to add more kind of speed bumps in the process. It's just to kind of streamline what's already been happening more or less and kind of align it a bit more with the radiocarbon dating team. But the framework is very adaptable, so it's not really meant to be a rigid process. It's meant to kind of, again, each project's going to be slightly different. It might have other kind of aspects that need to be considered, and that's completely fine. It's just to try to kind of get everyone to more or less the same level of support. And larger programs will also be more complicated, as they always are. So it's kind of giving teams a bit more kind of structure there. And as always, we're all quite highly collaborative, so that's not going to stop. That's actually, we'll be encouraged to keep working with different teams, labs, other specialists out there as well. And again, always going back to kind of that crux of kind of maximizing the archaeology and minimizing the destruction. So the next steps that we've got is, again, this is all quite new, so we won't be kind of retroactively applying this approach to, maybe projects that are already kind of in the HCP process. But as new projects start to enter, we'll start to work with this new framework. Eventually, we'll start to expand beyond just the human remains, but to all their bioarchaeological materials. Again, that process will be more or less fairly similar to what we have for human remains, but again, things like archaeozoology or archaeobotany may have additional steps that they require. So we'll sort of build that in. And really, what's quite important for HE and for myself is to have ongoing engagement with specialists such as yourself. And we'll be reviewing this framework after 18 months to sort of see how it's going, how we can maybe improve, if anything needs to change. And this will be kind of a great opportunity to get everyone's feedback as well of things that maybe they would also like to see or potentially adapt and change. So that's it for me, but I'm quite interested to hear what all of your thoughts are. So I might stop sharing my screen. Right.
Yeah. Just out of interest, where can people find a copy of it?
Well, that's a very good question. So what we will do is we are currently going to be updating our human remains page on HE, and we'll have a link to it there. So that way you can always just download the flowchart with the little blurb. So it'll all be kind of someplace that we can find, and we can also send it around as well.
Often do you sort of update it? Is it just a continuous thing, or do you do sort of workshops and talk to people, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what we will probably do, because it is sort of a newer strategy that we're kind of rolling out, and we do very much want to get kind of feedback as we go along. I think we may do some different workshops or maybe kind of webinars or things like that. That way we can kind of see how people are finding it. I think what's sort of difficult sometimes with these HCP projects is they're not kind of a consistent number that we get each year. It kind of change and varies, so it's sort of hard to get a good feel. And each one is quite variable in terms of either the size or the complexity. So kind of getting some case studies in is always kind of a bit of the challenge to start with, but we're also going to roll it out within our own projects that we do within Historic England to also start to kind of trial it out and work out any kinks there as well. So I think especially kind of as we kind of get past that first year, really towards that 18 months, I think that's when we're going to probably try to have another kind of larger touchstone with everyone and see how we're doing. Hopefully we'll have more than maybe just one. That would be otherwise it might be kind of hard to adjust too much. But again, it'll be kind of an ongoing process, so it's not kind of meant to be stagnant at all.
Okay. Good. Are there any other questions? Oh, yeah. Do you want to, can you unmute yourself, or do I need to unmute you?
I think I'm unmuted.
Yeah.
Good.
Yes, hello, Sarah. That was very interesting. Just wanted to make the point that I agree wholeheartedly with all the issues that you raised, particularly timescales, inaccessibility of data that you receive. And yes, more often than not, people do get forced into working according to the labs. Just really to make the point that HS2 is going to be the biggest test case ever. Because for those of you that don't know, Access Plus, I'm a member of Access Plus, I'm the lead osteologist for the project, but we are working very closely with Historic England and a number of other academic partners and labs to really apply the approach that you're talking about now. So
yeah, it'll be great to work with you on this one. See how we get on. That kind of the most extreme side of things.
Absolutely, yes.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, it's always good to hear.
Terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes it's hard as well, isn't it? Either you have the extreme side that you're dealing with, or you've got sometimes the smaller side where you've got maybe, a couple burials, and it sometimes that it can be quite difficult to then, do things in isolation. That's always a
Yes,
challenge,
yes.
so I think sometimes what's good, hopefully, with what we're trying to get towards is, in those cases, it's not so cut and dry, really, that, there's flexibility to see, maybe there's um like an isotope specialist that's kind of devising a new kind of method for diet, and these couple burials can feed into a bigger project. That could be a way to sort of help mitigate that loss rather than trying to figure out what three Romans were eating,
Yes.
that kind
I
of
think
thing.
I mean that's where this whole kind of, wider research approach is really important. It shouldn't just be, oh, I need to get DNA analysis done, I need to get isotope analysis done. It's got to be why, really. I mean, it sounds very, very basic,
It
but
does.
it's very, very important. And I get, HS2 gives us the opportunity to look at the wider situation. And I think osteologists working in isolation, to an extent, in archaeological commercial companies, they're going to have project managers saying, oh, we need to do DNA, we need to do this, because it's just it's a knee-jerk reaction, and it's not necessarily the way forward in every case. So I mean, obviously science in the dead is fantastic, but there's definitely a huge gap,
Yeah.
really. And I think this is going to go a long way to helping us there.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'll be working with you quite closely on how to kind of fine tweak some things. But I think it is quite hard when you've got that kind of pressure sometimes of, it's almost, at least from what I've been seeing as well, it's sort of like these destructive approaches are becoming sort of standard, like our aging or sexing, or, it's becoming kind of morphed into that a little bit. And, obviously there's the ethical implications though of that loss, and that can be hard to get across as well sometimes. And kind of, yes, the idea to kind of, I think maybe as osteologists, I'm guilty of this as well, is sometimes we want to kind of not hoard the data, we want to share it, but we feel like we have to collect everything that we've
Yes.
got in front of us, and that's not always necessary, really. We don't always need to be doing that. So I think it's kind of a good opportunity to kind of pivot a little bit and kind of rethink how we approach this type of work, especially because, if I take 20 measurements of a long bone, that's my time that's probably hurting, but it's not really going to impact much. But if we start sampling, molars or things like that, that actually does have quite a loss as
Oh
well.
yeah,
So
when they're gone, they're gone. That's
yeah,
that's
yeah.
it.
Just to jump in there, I think it's also really important that you've flagged up that unused material should be returned back to the assemblage, and that there should be full documentation of what sampling's happened, on which individuals, what was successful, how much has been taken, what's been returned, because when that's then passed to a museum repository at some point, hopefully in time, it's really important to have that so that individuals aren't then being repeatedly sampled for the same methods that's gone on before. So that's a really important point to have in there.
Yeah, definitely.
I recently was involved in a situation where samples, well, the remnants of samples were returned 15 years after the event. And the person who had organised the sampling, the archaeologist, was dead. And nobody knew, because it was not documented. So suddenly we got these remnants back, and thought, oh, so you actually did do this work. Where are the results?
Oh no.
That's,
that does happen, doesn't it?
Mm.
Yeah,
yes,
things sort of,
it
and
does.
then that memory is gone, or that knowledge of what, why was that done, or what we were
Yeah.
trying to do. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of also thinking, I guess, kind of that tie, isn't it, of kind of taking us from that post-excavation phase to the archive phase, because once they're deposited, we do have kind of a bit more rigorous um approaches to how we, like if institutions allow destructive work to happen, usually there's quite, you need your clear questions. If it's a research council funded project, usually you have to have some sort of ethical statement involved, but we're a little bit, we're not quite as stringent for some reason in that post-X phase. So we're kind of essentially depositing material that's already heavily sampled. And then we kind of change the rules a little bit. So it's just sort of trying to be consistent, I suppose, throughout that process.
Yeah. I mean, I thought now is definitely the time to be doing that, because everything is, it's going crazy now, and I wonder if, I don't know, some sort of countrywide database, or I don't know. I'm just thinking aloud.
No, it's kind of the time to do it, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. It's kind of it's good. It's exciting on one hand because it's easy to get. I can get quite carried away with, oh, but what about if we try doing it like this? But it's always sort of, but bringing it back. Okay, wait a minute. What are we actually trying to get here, and is that actually viable even?
Yeah.
Okay. I've just realized that the chat's not working.
Oh.
Super helpful. So if anyone has a question, please, put your hand up. But if not, yeah, I don't.
Well, in the flow chart, I could always, it would actually be great if I sent it to your guys as well, with the little kind of blurb, because it does have my contact details too. So if something comes to mind, you
Or
can, or I can give them as well in here
we have
too.
a question. Do you want to go ahead? Hello, it's nice to see you as well, by the way.
Hey, yeah, I finally made it. So I might have missed this, a bit shattered today, but are you handling the analysis in-house, or are you partnering with other labs?
So it'll be with other labs. So and it's also kind of an opportunity to kind of find labs that work best for that question, maybe, or that bit of research. I know a lot of different projects work closely with certain labs, so there's no kind of obstruction to that at all. It's if people kind of work quite closely, or have those kind of relationships, that's not a problem. It's just kind of, making sure that we get really their input, to be honest, as specialists, whether that's a DNA specialist or an isotope specialist, because they're the ones that can clearly also, help refine research questions to make sure they can actually answer that. I kind of did this as myself recently with a bit of work with the crick, actually. I think a lot of us have worked with them at some point.
Yeah.
Basically with Tom, a lot of back and forth, like, first there's some ideas. Does that actually work? Yes or no? And he very kindly answered. I then put some questions together, and he kind of helped refine those into a way that could actually be answered with the DNA. And making sure that, I'm asking the right kinds of questions, and also that I've got the right number of samples. Because that's always another thing as well. I think sometimes we can kind of make those, generally speaking, we can have an idea, but, things like highly specific, ancient DNA, I'm not a specialist in that, but it's all about kind of talking to the people that are and getting their input. And that's kind of the whole kind of purpose of this framework, is to kind of reach out to people that, if there's someone highly into proteomics. There's a couple people out there, you know, it's kind of getting their insights as well to kind of build something quite collaboratively. So again, it's not going to be like we only have a set number of labs that we'll work with, you know, there's always flexibility in all these sorts of things. And that's kind of what that whole initial discussion is as well, that, you know, kind of once we get kind of past that assessment and kind of that those initial talks, it's all about kind of thinking about, okay, so who are we thinking about going to, and what advice might we need, and all of that kind of stuff. Hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that does, and that's actually quite helpful because I'm staring down the barrel of a project that I really want to do stable isotope analysis for, and I think it would be, like, I do have a really good research question for it, but the thing is, I've not done that before. That is not my wheelhouse.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I would definitely appreciate guidance, especially from HE, so.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's it because you know, you as a specialist, you know, yeah, kind of drive the questions really. You know what's kind of interesting, but yeah, it's kind of like, have I framed it in the right way that actually is gonna
Yeah, it's
answer,
questions
or
of how many should I send, what
yeah,
condition are they in, what am I sending, like this sort of thing.
yeah,
So
and a
really,
lot
really
of.
basic questions, but
Well, no, but you know that's a really good point. Yeah, I do that all the time. You know, I have a couple of people I work with quite a lot, just 'cause I kind of happen to know them as well, and they're kind of highly specialized in very specific niche areas, and they're always very honest of, you know, like, no, you can't do that, but you can do that, or well, if you want to do this bit, you need to actually, you know, think about X, Y, Z. I had one where I was looking at migration as well. And I had some questions, and he was actually like, well, hold on a minute, this particular geography, well, you might find that they all look quite closely related, but it goes from, you know, Wales all the way through the Midlands. So actually, we might want to think about doing a baseline as, you know, so it's all of that kind of stuff that they've dealt with as well for that kind of detailed. And that's kind of the guidance that we want to bring in to help make sure that we're approaching things in the right way. We're thinking about the samples in the right way. And yeah, if we need to kind of build it out more, you know, get kind of more of that environmental archaeology integrated, sometimes that's kind of necessary. So that's kind of all about that kind of initial discussion phase, really, is figuring out what are we trying to do, what's feasible, what other advice do we need, and you know, and then also building in other specialists. So if it's, you know, yourself and then maybe the zooarchaeologist, you know, it's kind of building these little kind of teams as well a bit more, and giving you that support to do so. So
great. Okay, thank you.
yeah, yeah.
Does help if I'm not muted. Anyone else have a question? Yeah, Bev?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm just curious. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you guys, with Historic England, would you run this across with Historic Scotland, etc., as well, and run something similar, like
Oh,
this type of program?
yeah. I mean, we're all quite new at the moment, so. But that's definitely something we could consider, and kind of have some discussions about, if that would be, yeah, be quite useful. We're all kind of in the same boat, aren't we? So,
Yeah, it's true.
yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I'll make a little, I'm making little notes as well. But yeah,
I
yeah,
just wondered. Yeah.
yeah, no, it's a good point though. Um,
Sorry, I'm up in Scotland now, so I'm not in London anymore. So,
right, right.
and,
Yeah. No,
the
no, yeah,
questions.
that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll definitely look into it. And you can always, I can always put my email in the chat or something if that's helpful at all, maybe, or if you want to pass it around. If things
Yeah, we
come to
can
you.
do. We could get Cara to put it in when she announces the next Osteobite.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. Last call for questions. Is any more? I don't think so. Okay, good. All right. Well, thanks again, Sarah. That was really, really good, really interesting. Our next Osteobite will be the 31st of July. And that's going to be Claire Hodson from Durham University. So Carla will be sending out some information on that probably in the next week or two. So keep an eye out for that. And then she'll also be putting this up on the YouTube channel as well if you want to come back and watch it again. Okay. If you have any questions, you can always just email the group email and get back to us.